Hello and welcome to this video that's looking at Tissue by Imtiaz Darka. Now, Darka's quite interesting as a person and a poet because she was born in Pakistan and raised in Glasgow, and because of her circumstances she now lives partly in Wales and in London and in India, in Mumbai. And so you can see that Darka is quite a well-travelled person, but also a person that is across nations in terms of where she lives. So you can see there's a number of different influences in her identity. But also added to that is her job and the things that she does is that she's a documentary filmmaker, an artist, and a poet. So you can see that she's not one thing or another, that she's a number of different things. And she even describes herself as a Scottish Muslim Calvinist. Now, obviously, we know about Muslims, but as a Calvinist is a form of Protestantism, and it's quite a specific form of Christianity. And it's with the idea that they believe, Calvinists believe, that God has already decided who's going to go in heaven and who isn't going to go in heaven, and that decision has been made long before you were born. And so that whatever you do in life, it doesn't have that much of an influence in the way that what happens later on when you die. So quite an interesting person. So she's got lots of different influences, lots of different ideas and things that are kind of, a collection of different elements that make up this poet. So it's quite an interesting thing to think about when we look at this poem, because I would argue that actually the poets, the fact that she has a number of different elements to her, feed into this poem that we're going to look at. So one of the things that it says in Wikipedia, and I think, Wikipedia isn't always a reliable source, but I thought this was a really, really interesting thing because it does link into the poet herself. And it says that her poetry follows some of these key themes about home, freedom, journeys, geographical and cultural displacement. That means moving geography and the place that you live or where you reside in. Communal conflict and gender politics. So you can see some of those ideas are there already before we even look at the poem. Now, before we look at the poem, I want us to look at Darka's style of poetry. And I want us to start building a picture, because poets don't just write one poem, and they tend to have a style. And like musicians, we could listen to a song from Lady Gaga without even knowing it's from Lady Gaga, but we can recognize the sound. There's a particular sound that we've got associated to particular artists. And the same happens with art and paintings. We can spot a Rembrandt painting very easily from the artwork itself. So poets are like that in that they have a particular style. And I want us to have a clear idea of what Darka's style is before we look at the poem that we're going to look at. So this is another poem, and it's an old GCSE poem that was used on an old anthology. So this will not be in the exam, but it just gives you an idea of the kind of way that she writes. So here we've got the poem. I'm just going to read it to you. The skin cracks like a pod. There never is enough water. Imagine the drip of it, the small splash, echo in a tin mug, the voice of a kindly God. Sometimes the sudden rush of fortune, the municipal pipe bursts, silver crashes to the ground, and the flow has found a roar of tongues from the huts, a congregation. Every man, woman, child, for streets around, butts in with pots, brass, copper, aluminium, plastic buckets, frantic hands, and naked children screaming in the liquid sun, their highlights polished to perfection, flashing light as the blessing sings over their small bones. So for me, it's a really interesting poem. Okay, simply, this poem is about a pipe bursting, and we assume that it's in possibly India. and the pipe's bursting, and you've got everybody rushing around to fill water, fill their pots full of water, because obviously in here it's a blessing. The water is a blessing. Maybe they can't get to water, so this could be in a slum. And so these people who don't have access to clean water on a regular basis, when the pipe bursts, they're rushing to get it. And before we actually look at the poem we're going to study, I want us to just think about this and about how Doug has a particular style. So I'm going to ask you that question. How does it reflect that Darker is a documentary maker? Well, for me, the answer to that question is the way that it's very, very visual. Okay, and documentaries are trying to recapture something that's happening, so some event or something. So here, in a way, it is kind of a moment in a documentary. It's watching these different types of people come together at the pipe. So I'd say that her poetry is a very visual, and if you're a documentary maker, you are taking pictures and film, and you're trying to tell a story. So that's one of the things I want to look at her poem and see, has it got that documentary feel, that it's being very visual as a poem. The other thing that Darker does is that she explores how humans from all backgrounds are connected. So she's looking at the connectivity of people. So how does this poem link into this idea that people from all different backgrounds are somehow connected together? Well, the answer to this is simply the water. We all need water, and so the pipe bursting makes all the different people move in the location to get the water. So we've got man, woman, child. They're all equal at this point. They all need water, and the pots and the different pots and pans kind of show us the background that we've got for these different people. So some people have just probably got clay pots. Some people have got brass and copper and aluminium that are quite, maybe expensive, and then some might have plastic buckets that are quite cheaper. So you can see that we've got different types of people all connected in the need for water, and so we've got that connection. Can we see elements of Darker's religious beliefs in the ideas here in the poem? Well, to start off with, I'd say the title is a clear idea of religion, isn't it? A blessing is a gift from God. And so we've got this idea. But also, if we have a look at how people are behaving in this poem, they're all rushing to get to things. They're congregating. And think about it, a congregation, we associate that with church, don't we? We congregate together to pray. And almost in a way that the children are praying, and everybody's praying to this water. So we kind of see those religious elements in there. Another thing that Darker does in her poems is she uses symbols to be of a bigger issue. Can you see that in this poem here? I'd say the water, the splashing of the water, the coming together to get that water is all part of a bigger issue, isn't it? Of how, you don't need money to survive, you need water. And so this is about how human right that everybody should have access to clean water. And this is about that bigger issue there, about how important water is and how it's not money that's important, but it's water. So you can see how Darker is presenting a bigger issue. Okay, now we're going to look at some of the big ideas in the poem and do some thinking. Remember, it's important that when we're writing about poetry, we think of the ideas first. It's too easy to look at a technique, because what we've got to do is think, actually, stop here. What is the poet saying? What's the ideas? What's the kind of thing that they're addressing in this poem? So here are the three questions then. So what do all humans have in common with each other? So what connects us all together? What symbols could be used to join people together from different nations? And an interesting one, how can paper be used as a symbol of human life and experience? So just pause the video and just jot down what ideas you've got in relation to those different questions. Now remember, we're just doing this before we look at the poem, and we'll come back to these questions after we've read the poem and seen what the poet has said about them. So pause the video now. Okay, so what do all humans have in common with each other? So what connects us? Well, we've already talked about water connects us, but we could also say that family is what connects us, but also that our need for food and breathing and those sorts of things that we have in common. Okay, what symbols could be used to join people together from different nations? So it's quite tricky. So in the poem we looked at the blessing, it talked about water and how water connects people. Maybe we could use images about families and linking into that, that's what connects us together, or maybe even air that we breathe. How can paper be used as a symbol of human life and experience? Right, that's a really tricky one, because I think that's what the poem is all about. And so I'm going to leave that question because we're going to talk about it as we go through the poem. So the poem is called Tissue, and I'm going to read it to you now. Paper that lets the light shine through. This is what could alter things. Paper thinned by age or touching. The kind you find in well-used books. The back of the Quran, where a hand has written in the names and histories. Who was born to whom? The height and weight. Who died where and how? On sepia date. Pages smothered and stroked and turned transparent with attention. If buildings were paper, I might feel their drift, see how easily they fall away on a sigh, a shift in the direction of the wind. Maps too, the sun shines through, their borderlines, the marks that rivers make, roads, rail tracks, mountain folds. Fine slips from grocery shops that say how much was sold and what was paid by credit card might fly our lives like paper kites. An architect could use all this, place layer over layer, luminous, script over numbers over line, and never wish to build again with brick or block, but let the daylight break through capitals and monoliths, through the shapes that pride can make, find a way to trace a grand design. With living tissue, raise a structure never meant to last, of paper smooth and stroked and thin to be transparent, turned into your skin. This poem is a tricky poem, and it's a poem that a lot of students struggle with because it's got lots of symbols. It doesn't have a clear beginning, middle and end in terms of a story and a journey, but it's got lots of bits of ideas there. And it's a very, very symbolic poem. And that's where some people find it very, very difficult. But the key thing is this idea of connecting skin to paper, and the idea that paper is a symbol of our lives and it reflects our lives. And in a way that if you scrunch up paper and unfold it, paper looks like skin. And it's that idea that actually paper scrunched up and the way that we treat paper is reflected how our bodies are and how humans are in life. Because actually, the older you get, what happens to your skin? It gets more wrinkly. The more paper is manipulated and folded and touched, it changes. The paper changes. So the idea that skin and paper are very, very similar. In fact, the more paper is used, the thinner it gets, the weaker it gets. The more we grow, the thinner our skin gets and the weaker we get. And so, for example, those people with, old relatives, they know that how, their skin is very, very thin. And so if they hurt themselves or cut themselves, it's more of an issue for them than it is to somebody that's younger, because young skin heals quickly and bounces back. So you can see how there is that connection there. The other thing in this, and it links into DNA, is this idea that actually there's a plan, and actually, that things are planned. So we know with DNA that there is within our cells, there is instructions. There is a plan for what should happen in your body and how your body should look and the shape of cells and all those different things that make us. So there is, in a way, DNA is a grand plan, a design. And what DNA is actually a blueprint for what we should look like and how we should be. So there are some conflicting and interesting ideas in this poem. This idea how skin is like paper and how there is a big design in our life. So if you keep those ideas in your head when you read the poem and when we go through the questions, that should hopefully help you understand and think, right, how does this link into paper and skin? How does it link into this idea that there is a grand design? Because if we think about the grand design, we could be thinking about religion. And we know that we do have a religious poet. So it could be an element in there. So let's go back to our questions then. So let's think about this. What do all humans have in common with each other? What symbols could be used to join people together from different nations? How can paper be used as a symbol of human life and experience? So just going to pause the video. So press pause, and then once the pause symbol's disappeared, we're going to go through some ideas. Okay, so let's go with some of these ideas then. Okay, so what do we have? So in the poem, what common experiences we have. So if you have a look in the poem, it's about people being born. So we have those common elements with each other. Somebody in our family's been born, but also we have that common element that people are going to be born and people are going to die. And so that's what connects us in a way. But also we've got other connections in the poem, because there's connections in the buildings. And so how we all go shopping to the grocery shop and how we buy things. So there's all connections in our life, and that's what we've got common in each other. But also what's common in each other is that as we get older, we get weaker. And that's another common thing. So the poet is showing us shared life experiences. We all go shopping, we're all born, and sadly, at some point we may die. And so all these things are common. And so the poet is getting across these common experiences. We may live in different countries, but we all have shared experiences. We all go shopping, or we all have food, we all live in buildings, and we all have train tracks and roads and rivers in our countries. So it's about those common experiences. What symbols could be used to join people together from different nations? Well, you can say we've got this idea of, receipts. Everybody buys something and they have receipts. We've got this idea about how we all have books that we might write our names in. And we've got here the Quran, but it is something that Christians do sometimes in Bibles. They write the names of people, their family, and we often write our names in books, which is something quite common that we do. It's that kind of ownership of things. How can paper be used as a symbol of human life and experience? Well, we kind of addressed that because we're saying that paper is like skin and that it's fragile and that it can be strong, but also it can be weak. And the older we get, the weaker it gets. So if you have a look at the poem, and I'm just going to pick out a few things just to work on it. So we see in the poem paper used in different ways. So we see the books that mark the births and deaths. We see maps, and so maps tell us where to live and where to go and how we're connected between people. But also we see the receipts from grocery shops. And the grocery shops, really, that kind of shows our day-to-day life, doesn't it? Where we live, but also what we buy and what we eat. And I'm sure if we looked at the receipts from your weekly Tesco shop that your parents do, that might tell us about your life and something about it. It shows us something quite unique. We all go shopping, we all have people shop for us if we're lucky, but we all have that kind of connection together. And then we've got this last bit here about an architect. An architect is somebody that plans and designs how a building should look and what materials. And possibly this could be a link to a divine being. It could be a link to God or another divine figure, and controlling and designing. And remember, going back to that DNA, the idea of an architect planning something out. And this links into that Calvinist idea that actually somebody has decided our life before us, before we're born. And that idea of, us going into heaven is already decided for us, that there is a plan, that we are fixed on a journey, and that this, in a way, our story's been written for us. And we're just living our life through paper, this grand design. And then we have that last thing, by paper being smooth and then turned into skin, that idea that paper and skin, that connection of those two images together. So hopefully that gives you a bit more sense of what the poem is about, of looking about how paper links to our lives and kind of reflects that connection between humans. Okay. So we're going to carry on with our usual structure. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at some imagery that's used in the poem. So 3 images that we've got. So we've got maps, we've got the idea of kite, and then we've got the idea of the architect designing a building. So I want to think now, pause the video and just think, why has the poet chosen those particular images? They're key images in the poem. So why has the poet chosen those particular images? Okay, so let's go through things. So we're going to start off with the idea of maps. Okay, and so a map is really just a visual representation of what the world kind of looks like. And Mrs. Hawthorne will be very pleased that we're talking about maps, because maps are important for geography. But when we're thinking about maps, it's that idea here of how things change and move. And so we're all trying to make sense of our life. And that's what a map is, isn't it? It's trying to make sense of the world around us, so we know what something is and where it is and how to get there. And then I'd say that the map is a key symbol, because it's that idea of looking for meaning and trying to make sense and understand our place in the world. Because that's what a map does. That tells you where you are. And a lot of maps we have, you are here, don't we? So it's that idea of a person's position in the world. And actually, it's about humans as well, because that's what map makers do. They're trying to document and trying to record what the world looks like. And we know, and good old Miss Hawthorne will be able to back me up and support me about this, but we know that the world is constantly changing. And we know that maps are changing. And we know that coastal erosion, urbanisation, changes the landscape. And things are built and things are moving. So in the poem, maps change and they're moving about. So this is that idea of things not being the same all the time, and that things are going on a journey and things are moving and changing there. So that's one of the reasons that we've got in there, this idea that as humans, we like to mark down and measure and kind of work out where we are in our lives and in our society and in the world. Look at social media. Isn't that what really is a map? We're trying to map our lives, and we're doing it through social media. It could be Instagram, it could be Facebook, depending on how old you are. But that's what we're doing. We're trying to document and map our life. Let's look at the next image. So the next image is quite interesting, because when we look at kites are quite positive images, and they make us think of childhood. They make us think of freedom, because that's what kites are. They're trying to get free, aren't they? And so it's the idea that we throw a kite up into the air and they're blowing away, and the only thing that's keeping the kite from flying away is that one little thread that's the connection to the rest of the earth. And if we look at the poem and where it says this, it says fine slips from grocery shops that say how much was sold and what was paid by credit cards might fly our lives like paper kites. So in a way, what we could be viewing here is this idea that our lives and our world is kind of controlled by money. And what's holding us back. So if we look at this symbol as being a metaphor, that maybe the actual kite are humans, and what's keeping us grounded or holding us back is our money and the fact that we've got to buy things. And it mentions paid by credit cards. And I think that's quite a little thing there, because that a credit card is a debt. So you owe the bank. So it's this idea that money holds us back from being free and from being a better person. So it's that kind of attachment that we've got there. And the last one, the image that we're going to talk about, is this idea of the architect. And another word for architect, the idea of being about a godly figure, is somebody controlling our lives, some higher power. And as we know that she was a Calvinist, and their idea as a form of Christianity is the idea that God has got a plan for you and it's already been decided that you don't have any free will. So this idea that our lives are already planned out for us. So in a way that could be a negative image, because in the fact that we don't have freedom. But on the other hand, it could be quite a positive image, because it means that actually, if we're going to go to heaven, we're going to go to heaven regardless of what we do. So it does have quite an open-ended message and interpretation behind that idea. Okay, so now we're going to have a look at the way that the poem's written. So pause the video and just jot down what interesting things you think you can say about the language that's used here. Think about any techniques you can spot and how it links into the overall meaning of the poem. Okay, so let's have a look at things together then. So if we have a look, now I think this word thinned, it starts at the beginning of the poem and you can see at the end of the poem as well. It repeats this word thin. Now, I think it's a really interesting word, because this idea is that we get weaker. And I think that is something that we're seeing, that we're changing, that paper changes and like people change. And I think one of the things that the poem shows us is how fragile humans are, and how actually, like paper, we get weaker over time. The more you use a piece of paper, the weaker it gets, and how it changes itself. So that verb there, very, very interesting verb when we look at the poem. And let's look at the next one then. So drift. Now this is an interesting word to look at, because drift, we think of drift in terms of boats. And when a boat is drifting, it means that it's not attached to anything. So it's not attached to a harbour or a jetty, or it's not attached to an anchor. And it means that it's softly, slowly moving away from where it should be. And so in a way, it's kind of a negative word that we've got here, and as a verb. But it's almost a way that we kind of got this idea of things changing. And we're seeing a bit of a pattern, that things are changing. And we're getting lots of words and images associated with life is about changes. And so here it says, if the buildings were paper, I might feel their drift. And so it's the idea that things are slowly moving and changing bit by bit, and how we don't really notice these changes until, unless it's in paper that we see them, in something quite easily we can see the changes. But buildings don't, and so it's that idea of sudden small little changes. So it might be an extension, or it might change the windows, or it might add a little bit more to the building. But we don't see these changes very easily. And so, for example, when we see lapsed photography of the way that places have changed over time, you then see those changes, but you don't see them on a day-to-day basis. So that word there, drift, is a really interesting word. Look at the next one then. We know with poetry that light and darkness is imagery that's used a lot by poets. And obviously, light is a positive, a hopeful image, and darkness tends to be something bleak and depressing. So here we've got this idea of the sun shining through borderlines. And I'm going to say that borderlines are a bit like our drifting and the things that are thinning, because borderlines change. Wars mean that country borderlines change or extend or shrink. And so the borderlines are not the same all the time. They're constantly changing. And it's quite interesting that at the moment, Brexit, we're looking at our borderlines, and our borderlines are changing. And so you can see how, again, we're looking at that change. Things aren't always the same, and it's about things developing. Now, in the poem, we've got the mention of the sun. And the sun is the one consistent. And in the way, the borderlines are going to change, but the sun will still be the same sun, and it won't change. So we, in a way, we kind of got that relationship between humans and God or divine being. So the idea that God and religion is the same, yet the world changes all the time. And we can see that there in this imagery here, that we've got this idea of a powerful being that's consistent, that's clear, that's strong, that doesn't change, but then we've got the world around us and humans that are changing all the time. And we're seeing those two things. So on one level, it's about religion, but another level, it's about humans and how we're constantly changing. And we only need to put the word evolution into the equation, and we can see how this change starts making sense to us and how we're constantly evolving and changing. And then the last bit, a structure never meant to last of paper, smooth and stroked. So again, we've got this idea of structure never meant to last. Again, this is like borderlines. We're not meant to be immortal. We are meant to be mortal. And so that idea that things don't last. But also this little bit here, smooth and stroked. Now the poem includes lots of verbs associated with physical contact. So we get things like smooth, stroked, turned on stanza 3. And then at the end of the poem here, in the second to last stanza, we get smooth and stroked. And again, it's about that physical connection. And remember what we said, that the poet was looking at the connections, and the connections are about the physical contact, isn't it? So, making a link now to the poem Blessing, do we see how this poem is written by a documentary maker? Well, yes, there's lots of visual things in there, isn't there? Can we see the religious element? Yes, we can see the religious elements in there. So we can see quite a lot of elements that are in Darker's poetry. And so we can say that the style matches her other poems in a way. Now we're going to move on. Now remember, in the poem and the exam, you only need to mention one or two things. You don't need to mention everything. But what we want you to do is be able to talk about a poem and talk about ideas and link it into either the language, form or structure. So that's why we've structured it in this way. So let's have a look at the poem and look at the form of the poem. So the poem doesn't really follow any clear structure in terms of rhythm and in terms of rhyme. It's quite open, and in a way the poem is free verse, and it's kind of spontaneous, it's kind of abstract, it's kind of unsystematic, it's not regular. And I think in a way we can say that this poem is trying to reflect the nature of our life. And our life isn't ordered, it isn't structured, and that we use paper to try and structure it, but actually it is disorganized and irregular. And that's reflected in the way that the poem is written. And even if you have a look how the poem is written, in the fact, that we've got enjambment, sometimes there and sometimes not. And there isn't a clear structure behind the way that the poet does this. And in a way, I think, the poet is writing in a way that reflects how there isn't much structure to our lives, and that all the time we're trying to look for order and structure and an idea of what's guiding us. And at the end of the day, it is, according to the poem, something divine. That's got that structure. The sun, religion gives us that structure. Life isn't as structured, and we can see that in the poem, in the way that the enjambment's used, the way that the poet has used the free verse form, but also the fact when you look at how the poem is written, you would think that you would have this bit here as one stanza because there's a full stop, and that's a clear idea. But no, the poem keeps up, and it breaks up sentences across, which doesn't make sense in a way, because you think, well, keeping ideas together would be the key thing. And so it's showing us how disorganized, how unstructured our lives is. And what is the poet doing? The poet is trying to put some structure onto something in the world and our lives that has no structure. Okay, so now we're going to have a look at the structure of the poem. Now, the poem isn't structured in a typical way that we're used to some of the poems, where we have a clear journey, a starting point and an end point, and we see somebody go on a journey. This isn't one of those poems. It isn't one of those poems where we've got a before and an after. In fact, we've got a poem where we start where we begin and where we end. So it's all about paper. It starts and ends in paper. And so we could say that there's a cyclic nature to the way that this poem is structured. But also I'd say that really what the way the poem is structured is it's starting with an idea. So it's starting with the idea of paper and saying, paper is like humans. All right. And then at the end of the poem, it's reinforcing that. Look, I've shown you how paper and humans are alike. In a way, it's very different to the blessing poem because it isn't repeating the same start and ending. But here, the poem does. So it's making that clear connection of how our lives are like paper. So it's starting and ending. And that's the clear image that we've got there. When we look at the rest of the poem and how the rest of it's structured, so as the poem goes on, it's looking at how paper and humans are connected. So looking at books, then it's looking at buildings, and then maps, and then how our lives, the shopping. So we're seeing different elements of human life and how they're linked together to paper. And basically the poet is just making those connections to different elements of life and how humans and paper are linked together. I think this last section, the designing and planning, is in a way where the poet is giving a bigger message. And I think that bigger message is about linking in religion. We see religion there with the Quran, but I think here we're seeing it in this idea of having something bigger and stronger that's controlling and designing the way that we live our lives. And so that design and planning with the architect. And so we go from our ordinary lives, and then in a way we're kind of like going back to the divine being or God and who's in control. And it's kind of asking at this point the bigger question. Okay, so if life is changing all the time, why is it? And I think here it's the poet saying, well, this is God's plan. It's God's plan for us to do this. And then it links back to this idea of paper and humans and how actually there is a grand design, that somebody has written our lives for us and it's already planned for us. And interesting that the last word is skin and the first word of the poem is paper. And it's making that clear connection. Paper, skin. It starts with paper and it ends with skin. So moving on with the poem. So we've got some ideas about what the poem's about. We can spot some techniques about the poem. We're now going to think about the message. So we've got to think about, well, what is the poet really saying? This is the thing that pushes you up. So as soon as you mention a technique, this is what you've got to be doing then, explaining what the poet is doing. So are they criticizing? Are they teaching us? Are they attacking something? So these are some of the messages that we could be saying the poet is trying to do. She's trying to do, saying that we're all the same. And in a way we could say that this poem is celebrating that, how we're all the same. We're all thin and fragile, and we're all born and we're all going to die. It's that connectivity between people. Again, as I mentioned, that connection between each other. We all go shopping. We all have maps. We all use maps. We all, use roads and there's rivers. It's that connection, how we're all connected between each other. And I think it's kind of a poem that's against kind of racism, because it's, it is that idea that we're all alike. We're all the same. And I think that's what this poem is doing. It's celebrating that element there. It's a poem that exposes religion and how religion is behind life. Because I think one of the arguments that we do have with religion is that question about faith and why bad things happen. And in a way, what this poem is saying is that there's a plan, and there was a plan long before you were born. So there is a plan that's going on. And so it's answering those kind of questions, that there's a higher plan that's going on behind our lives. This idea of control and freedom, that we don't have freedom and we don't really have control, that we're connected and something else is controlling us. It could be money with the kite that's holding us from flying away, or it could be something bigger like the sun or a divine being. It's a poem that's teaching us about constant change, that life is constantly changing and there's constant movement. Remember, when we're talking about the message, we need to be thinking, where else do we see this in the poem? Why did the poet have this stance? Now, going back to the beginning of the video, we can see why the poet had this stance. What is the poet aiming to do? Why do they feel this? I think a lot of the poem is about connecting people and the idea of making connection. We know that Darka lives in a number of different countries, and so she's got an advantage. She's able to see how people in India are very similar to people in Wales, and people in London are similar to people in Wales, and vice versa. So she sees the connections between different places, and the poem is about seeing those connections and her attempting to make those connections between different groups of people. And this is a modern poem. So what's going on at the moment that might influence Darka? She might see that there's lots of divides in society between different nationalities and different ethnicities. So maybe she may be trying to unite and build connections between people. Okay, and remember, one of the things that we've got with the exam and the poetry is about making connections between the poems. So this poem in particular is a poem about memory. We've seen poems to do with memory, for example, Remains, extract from the prelude, about the power of memory and how things are constantly changing and remembering the past. The power of connections and connections. Now, we've got a lot of poems to do with nature and man's relationship with nature. And in the poem, this is about connections between man and other people, but also it's a poem that's about connections between mankind and the world. Maps show that the world is constantly changing over time, and this shows our connection with that world, that we're trying to map it, but the world is constantly changing around us. The poem is about the power of time and what time does. Let's go to Remains, and the poem Remains. Time doesn't heal in Remains. In this poem, time changes a person. And also this is about the power of nature, and that in a way nature is more powerful than mankind. The sun is stronger. The borderlines will move and change, but the sun will keep going. So nature is ever powerful and ever constant in our lives. The poem is a conflict between freedom and control. We could argue that this poem is about a lack of control and how mankind doesn't have control about their world. And so we can talk about other poems. Exposure, how the poem, the voice doesn't have control about the world and they feel helpless. We can talk about remains. We can talk about how Ozymandias, that sense of power and control will actually, nature is more powerful. We've got the conflict between man and nature, which we see in a number of different poems, and we've got the conflict between life and death. We could probably make a connection between poppies and that relationship between what's alive and what's dead, and the connection between things and how some things are inevitable. Another thing that we haven't mentioned is about how the title is called Tissue. It refers to paper a lot in the poem, but doesn't reflect the title Tissue. And if we think about tissue, tissue has two meanings. We can refer to tissue paper, thin material that is easily ripped, which links into the idea of skin. And the older you get, the more your skin becomes like tissue paper, and it's easily broken or injured. But also it can relate to human tissue, flesh, another word to describe flesh, parts of the body. So we've got the idea that tissue, and that idea that tissue is everybody's made of human tissue, cells that combine to make tissue. So you've got that idea that there's a connection there in the poem. Last thing before we finish then are quick little questions. So pause the video and just think about answering these questions. As soon as the pause symbol disappears, I'll go through the answers with you. Okay, so let's go through the answers then. So what different types of paper are referred to in the poem? So obviously you've got one there in front of you, so you've got the Quran, the idea that we've got it on maps, the receipts, we've got the architect's plans, so we can work on that there. Number two, what might you find in the back of the Quran? Well, you might find in terms of there about names of people who were born and their heights and their weights, and also people who've died. What is the last thing the poem mentions? The word skin. What T is the word used to describe what happens to paper over time? Thinned. What three R's could be found on maps? And that's rivers, roads, and rail tracks. What P starts the poem and what S ends the poem? So that's paper and skin. What comparison used to suggest that changes in life could be more obvious? And that's that idea about buildings. If buildings were paper, that would make changes obvious to us. What simile is used to show how money controls our life? That's the use of our lives like paper kites. And what short sentence is used to show how paper can have a concrete and fixed quality? And that's that short little sentence about halfway through the poem where it says maps too. Okay, remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel. There will be more videos coming up, and there are other videos of the different clusters that we've done as well. So please do check out these videos, and remember these videos when it comes to revision for the exams themselves. Thank you.